Good evening, everyone. Let me tell you a story that will stay with you long after the last word is spoken. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden rays casting long shadows over a quiet neighborhood. It was one of those evenings that felt almost harmonious, the kind where everything seems to hum with calmness. Michael Johnson, just an ordinary guy trying to live his life, was walking home after another exhausting day at work. You know how it goes when you've been on your feet all day? His legs ached, and his briefcase felt heavier than usual. But his mind? Oh, his mind wandered to simpler pleasures, a warm dinner, some TV, or maybe even catching up on that show he'd been meaning to finish. And let's not forget about much-needed rest. The cool breeze swept through the streets, offering relief from the heat of the day. Leaves rustled softly, their rough texture catching the fading sunlight as they danced across sidewalks cracked with age. Everything seemed so peaceful. But then, something shifted. As Michael turned a corner just blocks away from his apartment, he noticed something out of place. Ahead, parked by the curb, sat a police car. Two officers stood beside it, chatting casually like old friends sharing jokes. Their uniforms were crisp under the warm daylight, but there was something severe in the way they carried themselves. Something that made Michael instinctively lower his head, hoping to pass unnoticed. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't fear exactly. At least, that's what he told himself. It was survival. Too many stories had taught him that being black in this city meant even minding your own business could draw unwanted attention. So he kept moving, each step deliberate, his worn leather shoes scuffing lightly against the pavement. His dark blazer hung loosely over his broad shoulders, slightly wrinkled from hours of standing, while his neatly pressed slacks caught hints of the setting sun's glow. The sun was still hanging low in the sky, casting those long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Michael kept walking, his worn leather shoes scuffing lightly against the cracked pavement. His dark blazer hung loosely on his broad shoulders, slightly wrinkled from hours of standing. He had a briefcase in one hand, heavy, like it always was after work, and his mind wandered to simpler pleasures. Dinner, TV, rest. But then, he noticed it. Ahead of him, just around the corner where he'd be only blocks away from home, sat a police car. Two officers were leaning casually against it, chatting like old friends sharing jokes. Their crisp uniforms caught the warm daylight perfectly, but there was something severe about their presence. Something that made Michael instinctively lower his head, hoping to pass unnoticed. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't fear exactly. At least, that's what he told himself. It wasn't fear, it was survival. Too many stories had taught him that being black in this city meant even minding your own business could draw unwanted attention. So he kept moving, each step deliberate, trying not to make eye contact or give them any reason to stop him. But as fate would have it, just as he was about to pass the car, one of the officers stepped forward. "Hold on a second," the officer said, his tone casual but commanding. Michael froze mid-step, his stomach tightening instantly. He stopped, forcing himself to remain calm. "Good evening, officer," Michael said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Is there a problem?" The taller officer, a white man with a buzz cut, looked Michael up and down. His expression unreadable. "ID," he demanded, holding out his hand without explanation. Confusion washed over Michael's face. "Why? I'm just walking home." The officer narrowed his eyes slightly. "I said let me see your ID." His tone grew colder, sharper. Michael hesitated for only a moment before reaching slowly into his pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out his wallet. This is how it starts, he thought bitterly. Stories like these never ended well for people who looked like him. The sun was still hanging low in the sky, casting those long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Michael stood there, his worn leather shoes scuffing lightly against the cracked pavement. His dark blazer hung loosely on his broad shoulders, slightly wrinkled from hours of standing. He had a briefcase in one hand, heavier than usual, and his mind wandered to simpler pleasures. Dinner, TV, rest. But then, everything changed. One of the officers stepped in front of him, cutting off his path. "Hold on a second," the officer said, his tone casual but commanding. Michael froze mid-step, his stomach tightening instantly. He stopped, trying to remain calm. "Good evening, officer," Michael said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Is there a problem?" The taller officer, a white man with a buzz cut, looked Michael up and down. His expression unreadable. "ID," he demanded, holding out his hand without explanation. Confusion washed over Michael's face. "Why? I'm just walking home." The officer narrowed his eyes slightly. "I said let me see your ID." His tone grew colder, sharper. Michael hesitated for only a moment before reaching slowly into his pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed over his wallet. This is how it starts, he thought bitterly. Stories like these never ended well for people who looked like him. The first officer snatched the ID and passed it to his partner, who glanced at it briefly before looking back at Michael. "What are you doing out here?" the taller officer asked, his tone accusatory now. "I'm going home," Michael replied, frustration creeping into his otherwise calm voice. "I live just a few blocks away." The second officer chimed in, gesturing toward Michael's briefcase. "Mind if we take a look inside?" Michael's chest tightened with a mix of fear and anger. He knew his rights. He didn't have to let them search his belongings without a reason, but he also knew that refusing could make things worse. Much worse. "It's just work stuff," he said firmly. "Documents, files. Nothing illegal." The officers exchanged glances. Then, without warning, the mood shifted. The taller officer grabbed Michael's arm roughly. "Turn around." Hands on the car. Michael blinked, stunned. "What? Why?" "Turn around," the officer barked, shoving Michael against the hood of the police car. Pain shot through his shoulder as they twisted his arms behind his back. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists, biting into his skin. "I didn't do anything," Michael shouted, panic rising in his voice. But the officers ignored him, their hands rough and invasive as they patted him down. In the distance, bystanders gathered, some filming silently while others watched with detached expressions. No one stepped forward. The sound of the cruiser door slamming shut echoed in Michael's ears as he was thrown into the back seat, his future uncertain. The sun had long disappeared, leaving the city cloaked in shadows. The fluorescent lights of the station buzzed ominously, casting harsh reflections on cracked pavement and cold metal surfaces. Michael's heart pounded as they dragged him out of the cruiser, his wrists still bound by handcuffs that dug into his skin like a vice grip. His body ached from the rough handling earlier, his shoulder throbbed where it had been twisted unnaturally, but physical pain wasn't even close to what weighed most heavily on him. It was the suffocating realization that he was now at the mercy of a system designed not to protect him but to break him. Inside the station, the air smelled stale, a mix of disinfectant and something metallic, almost oppressive. A tired-looking sergeant barely glanced up from his desk as Michael was shoved forward. "Resisting arrest," one of the officers muttered casually, smirking as if this were just another routine day for them. Another charge followed, causing a disturbance. Michael's chest tightened. These weren't truths, they were lies. Fabricated accusations meant to justify their actions, to make him look like the aggressor. He wanted to shout, to scream that none of this was true, but deep down he knew better. His voice wouldn't matter here. No one cared about what he had to say, No one would believe him. They led him down a narrow corridor lined with heavy doors, each one leading to small windowless rooms, holding cells for people like him. The walls seemed endless, stretched thin by fear and uncertainty. Every step echoed off the concrete, amplifying the dread pooling in his stomach. Finally, they stopped in front of a door, unlocked it with an audible click, and pushed him inside. The cell was tiny, frigid, and empty except for a single metal bench bolted to the wall. The stark white walls made the space feel smaller, more suffocating. As soon as the door slammed shut behind him, Michael's breath hitched. The sound of the lock clicking into place reverberated through the room like a death knell. He leaned back against the cold bench, trying, and failing, to steady his racing thoughts. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time blurred together. All he could hear was the low hum of the air conditioning, its chill seeping into his bones. His body hurt everywhere, stiff muscles, throbbing wrists, and raw skin rubbed red by the cuffs. But worse than the physical pain was the emotional toll, the crushing weight of knowing that his truth didn't matter here. Suddenly, the door swung open again. 2 officers stepped in, their faces hard and unreadable. One held a clipboard, flipping through pages without looking directly at Michael. "Get up," the shorter officer barked, his voice sharp. Michael hesitated for a split second before standing slowly, wincing as his stiff legs protested the movement. They grabbed him roughly by the arms and pulled him back into the hallway, dragging him toward another room. This one felt darker, colder. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting distorted shadows across peeling paint. At the end of the hall, they shoved him into a small interrogation room. In the center stood a single chair facing a metal table. Without ceremony, they forced Michael into the seat, pulling his arms behind him and cuffing them tightly to the back of the chair. Now completely immobilized, Michael sat there, his mind racing. The shorter officer took a seat across from him, placing the clipboard on the table. Leaning forward, he folded his hands neatly and fixed Michael with a cold, calculating stare. "You know why you're here, right?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with menace. "I didn't do anything," Michael replied, his voice shaky despite his efforts to stay composed. The officer smirked, shaking his head. "See, that's where you're wrong. You were causing a disturbance. Resisting arrest. You gave us no choice." "That's not true." Michael's voice rose, panic creeping into his words. "I didn't resist. You just stopped me for no reason." The smirk vanished, replaced by a hard, dangerous expression. "Are you calling me a liar?" the officer growled, leaning closer. Michael swallowed hard, his heart slamming against his ribs. "I'm just saying I didn't do anything wrong." The officer slammed his hand down on the table, making Michael flinch. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look around, buddy. You're in here because no one gives a damn about you." Each word hit like a punch to the gut. Michael clenched his jaw, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. The officer stood up, walking around the table to stand behind him. Leaning down, he whispered menacingly into Michael's ear. "You're lucky we're not charging you with more. One more accusation, one more witness saying they saw you act out. Who's going to stop us?" Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had never felt so powerless, so trapped. The officer straightened up and walked back to the other side of the table, sitting down again. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice clinical and cold. "You're going to sit tight until we decide what to do with you. If you keep your mouth shut, maybe we'll let you out of here in a few days. But if you cause any more problems," he let the threat hang in the air, unfinished but unmistakable. When they finally left the room, slamming the door behind them, Michael sat there trembling, his mind reeling. Was this really happening? Would they follow through on their threats? And yet, buried beneath the fear and anger, there was still that faint spark of hope, the memory of those bystanders filming his arrest. Maybe someone had captured the truth. Maybe there was still a way out. The fluorescent lights buzzed ominously overhead, their sharp glare reflecting off the cracked pavement and cold metal surfaces. Michael sat alone in the sterile, unforgiving cell, his body stiff from hours, maybe days, of confinement. His wrists throbbed where the handcuffs had dug into his skin, leaving angry red marks that were now raw and swollen. The air smelled damp, almost suffocating, mingling with a faint scent of disinfectant that did little to mask the neglect of this place. He leaned back against the concrete wall, its rough texture pressing uncomfortably into his spine. His dark blazer was wrinkled beyond recognition now, hanging loosely over his broad shoulders like a forgotten shadow. His scuffed leather shoes rested on the cold floor, toes pointed inward as if trying to retreat further into himself. Every breath felt heavier than the last, each one pulling him deeper into despair. Time blurred together here. There were no windows to mark the passage of day or night, only the relentless hum of the air conditioning and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway outside. The walls seemed to close in around him, their stark white paint chipped and peeling, adding an almost cruel texture to the oppressive atmosphere. Michael's mind raced between flashes of anger and waves of helplessness. How had this happened? He hadn't done anything wrong. Just walked home like any other day. But here he was, locked away, accused of crimes he didn't commit, treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. No one cared, at least, that's how it felt. Every moment in the cell was a reminder that his voice didn't matter. His story, his truth meant nothing in the face of a system that had already decided his guilt the moment they laid eyes on him. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, suffocating, crushing his spirit. He could still hear the words of the officers echoing in his mind, the threats, the condescension, the outright cruelty. They had made it clear, he was powerless here. They could do whatever they wanted, and no one would stop them. His stomach churned at the thought. They could fabricate more charges, escalate the situation, and there would be nothing he could do to stop them. He knew what could happen to men like him in places like this. But even in the depths of his despair, there was a small spark of hope. Clinging to the memory of those people on the street, those bystanders who had witnessed his arrest, who had pulled out their phones and recorded the brutality, it was a faint hope, but it was all he had. Maybe, just maybe, someone had captured the truth. Maybe someone out there would speak up. Suddenly, the door to the cell swung open with a loud creak, jolting Michael from his thoughts. 2 officers stepped inside, their faces as cold and emotionless as ever. The taller one, the one who had first stopped Michael on the street, motioned for him to stand. "Get up," the officer barked. Michael pushed himself to his feet, wincing as his stiff muscles protested the movement. His body ached from the hours of confinement, but he refused to show weakness in front of them. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The officer grabbed him roughly by the arms and pulled him down the corridor. His mind raced as they dragged him through the dimly lit hallways. Where were they taking him now? Was this the moment they would follow through on their threats? He forced himself to breathe, to stay calm, but his heart hammered in his chest. They brought him to a small interrogation room. The walls were bare save for a single camera mounted in the corner, and a metal table sat in the center of the room with 2 chairs on either side. The officer shoved Michael into one of the chairs, his hands still cuffed behind his back, and then left without a word, slamming the door shut behind them. The room was cold, and the silence was oppressive. Michael's eyes flicked to the camera in the corner. Was it recording? Was anyone even watching? He doubted it. This was all for show, a facade of due process in a place where justice didn't exist for people like him. Hours passed in that small room. Michael's body ached from the uncomfortable chair, his wrists raw from the cuffs. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and frustration, but there was still that small spark of hope, the memory of those phones, those bystanders filming his arrest, flickering in his mind. Maybe someone had captured the truth. Maybe there was still a chance. The fluorescent lights buzzed ominously overhead, casting sharp shadows across the cold metal surfaces of the interrogation room. Michael sat cuffed to the chair, his wrists raw from the tightness of the cuffs. His dark blazer hung loosely on his broad shoulders, now wrinkled beyond recognition. His scuffed leather shoes rested firmly on the floor, toes pointed inward as if trying to retreat further into himself. Across the table sat the officer in the suit, his calm demeanor masking a menacing intent. The man leaned forward slightly, folding his hands neatly on the table. "So, Michael," he began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. "You know why you're here, right?" Michael stared at him, confusion and fear swirling in his mind. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice trembling. The officer smirked, shaking his head. "See, that's where you're wrong. You were causing a disturbance, resisting arrest. You gave us no choice." "That's not true." Michael's voice rose, panic seeping into his words. "I didn't resist. You just stopped me for no reason." The officer's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "Are you calling me a liar?" he asked, his tone dangerously low. Michael swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm just saying I didn't do anything wrong." The officer slammed his hand down on the table, causing Michael to flinch. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look around, buddy. You're in here because no one gives a damn about you." Michael's chest tightened with fear. He knew the officer was right, at least in part. He was trapped in a system that didn't care about him, one that saw him as guilty the moment they laid eyes on him. His voice, his truth meant nothing here. The officer stood up, walking around the table to stand behind Michael. He leaned down, his voice a low, threatening whisper. "You're lucky we're not charging you with more. We could easily make sure you don't walk out of here. All it takes is one more charge, one more witness to say they saw you act out. Who's going to stop us?" Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had never felt so powerless, so trapped. The officer's words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating him. He couldn't fight back, he couldn't argue. Anything he said could be twisted against him, used to justify whatever cruelty they decided to inflict. The officer straightened up and walked back to the other side of the table. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice cold and clinical. "You're going to sit tight until we decide what to do with you. If you keep your mouth shut, maybe we'll let you out of here in a few days. But if you cause any more problems, we'll make sure you regret it." Michael didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was reeling, his body trembling with fear and frustration. He had never felt so helpless. These men held all the power, and there was nothing he could do to change that. The officers left the room, slamming the door behind them. Michael sat there, still cuffed to the chair, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent now, except for the sound of his own ragged breathing. Hours passed, or at least, it felt like hours. The cold metal of the chair dug into his skin, and the handcuffs around his wrists had left them raw and bleeding. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. What if they really did keep him here for days? What if they made good on their threats? But deep down, Michael knew the truth. They didn't care about justice. They didn't care about the law. To them, he was just another black man. Someone to control, to intimidate, to silence. Suddenly, the door opened again, and the officers returned. They uncuffed him from the chair and dragged him back to the cell, throwing him inside like he was nothing more than garbage. The door slammed shut, and Michael was left alone in the cold, dark cell. His wrists throbbed, his body ached, but the worst pain was the one in his heart, the realization that his voice, his truth, meant nothing in this place. As he lay on the cold floor, his mind drifted back to the street where it had all begun. He had seen people recording the arrest, people with their phones out, capturing the moment. It was a small glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded him. Maybe, just maybe, someone had caught the truth. Maybe there was still a way out. The cold dampness of the cell had seeped into Michael's bones over what felt like an eternity. His wrists throbbed from the tight cuffs that bit into his skin, leaving angry red marks that burned with every movement. The bare walls of the holding cell seemed to press in on him, their stark whiteness almost mocking in its emptiness. He sat slumped against the metal bench bolted to the wall, his dark blazer wrinkled beyond recognition now, hanging loosely off his shoulders as if it were too heavy for him to carry. His mind raced between flashes of anger and waves of helplessness. How had this happened? He hadn't resisted. He hadn't caused any disturbance. Yet here he was, locked away, accused of crimes he didn't commit, treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin. Every moment in the cell was a reminder that his voice, his truth, meant nothing in the face of a system that had already decided his guilt before they even laid eyes on him. But then, something shifted. On the third day, or maybe it was the fourth, time blurred together in this place. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor once more. Michael braced himself, expecting another round of intimidation or threats from the officers who had made it clear they held all the power here. But when the door creaked open, the figure standing there wasn't one of them. It was someone different. An older man in a suit, his expression calm but weary, carrying a folder under his arm. "Mr. Johnson?" the man asked softly but firmly. Michael blinked, startled by the change in tone. This wasn't the sharp bark of authority he'd grown accustomed to hearing. Slowly, he pushed himself upright on the bench, rubbing his raw wrists as he nodded. "Yeah, that's me." The man stepped further into the cell, closing the door behind him. "My name is Eric Thompson," he said, extending a hand. "I'm your lawyer." Michael hesitated, staring at the outstretched hand. A lawyer? He hadn't called anyone. Who would have sent one? But after a beat, he reached out cautiously, shaking hands with Thompson. His grip was firm, grounding, a small reassurance in a world that had spun wildly out of control. "I didn't know I had a lawyer," Michael admitted, his voice hoarse from days of silence. "I didn't get to call anyone." Thompson gave a tight smile, though his eyes carried a weight of understanding. "You didn't have to. People outside have been making noise, a lot of noise. That video of your arrest went viral." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The video. Someone had seen it. Someone had spoken up. What does this mean?" Michael stammered, his voice trembling slightly. Thompson opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, glancing through them briefly before meeting Michael's gaze again. "It means the police department is in trouble, big trouble. The video shows everything, the excessive force, the arrest without cause, the brutality. People are furious. The public wants answers, and the media has been all over this story." Michael's mind raced, struggling to process the flood of information. It felt surreal, like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. After days of sitting in darkness, waiting for the hammer to fall, suddenly the tide had shifted in his favor. "Does this mean I'm getting out?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thompson nodded. "Yes. You're getting out. The charges are being dropped. The department is trying to cover its tracks, but it's too late. The damage is done. Your release has been expedited, and I'll be walking you out of here by the end of the day." For the first time since his arrest, Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. The crushing weight that had pressed down on his chest for days began to lift, and he could finally breathe again. He was getting out. He wasn't going to spend another night in this hellhole. But even as relief flooded his senses, there was a darker undercurrent Michael couldn't ignore. Yes, he was getting out, but what about all the others? The men who had been arrested and brutalized like him, but without the benefit of a viral video to expose the truth? How many of them had been silenced by a system that thrived on their suffering? Thompson seemed to sense the conflict in Michael's eyes. He closed the folder and leaned forward slightly, his voice softening. I know this has been a nightmare for you, and I'm not going to pretend that everything will be fine once you walk out of here. What happened to you is part of a much larger problem. But right now, the most important thing is that you're getting your freedom back. After that, we can talk about how to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Relief, anger, gratitude, frustration, all swirled inside him, overwhelming and conflicting. He wanted to believe that this was the beginning of justice, but he also knew how easily the system could shift its weight to crush those who dared to stand against it. When do I get out? Michael asked quietly, his voice trembling with exhaustion. Thompson glanced at his watch. Soon. I'm heading to the front desk to finalize the paperwork now. Once that's done, you'll be free to go. The lawyer stood up and gave Michael a reassuring nod before turning toward the door. Hang in there, Michael. You've been through hell, but it's almost over. As the door clicked shut behind him, Michael leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. The tension in his body began to unwind, but there was a new weight pressing down on him now. A different kind of burden. He was getting his freedom back, but the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fluorescent lights that had once felt suffocating now seemed dimmer as Michael stepped out of the station for the first time in days. His wrists still bore angry red marks from the handcuffs, and his body ached with every movement, but none of that mattered. He was outside. The air smelled different, cooler, fresher, and the sharp sunlight stung his eyes after so many hours spent in the sterile gloom of the cell. But it wasn't just the light or the air that hit him. It was the noise. Voices shouting, cameras flashing, signs held high above heads. A crowd had gathered outside the station, reporters, activists, strangers holding placards that read "Justice for Michael" and "Black Lives Matter." Their voices rose together like waves crashing against rocks, demanding answers, accountability, change. Michael froze on the top step of the station stairs, momentarily overwhelmed. This kind of attention wasn't something he'd ever imagined for himself. He was just an ordinary man trying to live his life, yet here he was, the center of everyone's focus. Reporters pushed forward, microphones thrust toward him, questions flying fast and furious. How does it feel to be free? What will you do next? Do you think this system can ever change? His stomach tightened. All these people wanted answers, but how could he explain what he barely understood himself? His mind raced back to those long nights in the cell, the fear, the anger, the helplessness. And now, this. Thompson, standing beside him, placed a firm hand on his shoulder. They're all here because of you, he said quietly, leaning in so only Michael could hear over the chaos. Because you stood up, and because the truth got out. This is bigger than just your case. Michael nodded slowly, his throat dry. He didn't know what to say, but the weight of Thompson's words sank deep into him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was a symbol, a spark igniting a much larger fire. As he moved through the crowd, flanked by supporters who reached out to touch his arm or offer quiet words of encouragement, Michael felt something stir within him. Solidarity. Strength. Hope. These people weren't just fighting for him. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, brutalized, ignored. A young woman handed him a flyer with bold letters across the top. "Protest tonight at City Hall." An older man patted his back and whispered, "We've got your back, son." Even the reporters, despite their relentless questioning, seemed to carry a sense of urgency, as if they knew his story mattered, not just today, but for years to come. For the first time since his arrest, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, good could triumph over evil. But as he climbed into the waiting car, a simple sedan driven by one of the activists who had organized the rally, he couldn't shake the sobering thought that this victory came at a cost. Not everyone had a viral video to save them. Not everyone had a crowd waiting outside the station doors. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the noise and commotion behind. Michael leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment. His dark blazer still hung loosely on his frame, wrinkled from days of confinement, and his scuffed leather shoes rested heavily on the floor mat. Despite everything, he looked exactly as he had when this nightmare began, except now, his spirit carried a new burden. This fight wasn't over. It never would be. And Michael knew he couldn't walk away, not when so many others were still trapped in systems designed to crush them. The car ride back to his apartment was a blur of muted city sounds and fleeting glances out the window. Michael sat slumped in the passenger seat, his body heavy with exhaustion but his mind buzzing like an exposed wire. The streets rolled by, familiar yet distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life now. His dark blazer hung limply on his shoulders, wrinkled from days of confinement, while his scuffed leather shoes tapped nervously against the floor mat, betraying the storm inside him. When the car finally pulled up to his building, he hesitated before stepping out. For a moment, he just stared at the cracked pavement beneath his feet, the red marks on his wrists catching the late afternoon light. He could still hear the echoes of the crowd outside the station, their shouts, their signs, their solidarity. It had been overwhelming, yes, but it had also been affirming, like a lifeline thrown into the darkest depths of despair. But now, standing alone in front of his apartment door, the weight of everything came crashing down again. This place, his sanctuary, felt foreign. The quiet hum of the hallway seemed almost deafening after days of fluorescent lights and relentless noise. He unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped inside, closing it softly behind him. The silence wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. Michael moved through the small space mechanically, dropping his keys onto the counter and shrugging off his blazer. He sank into the worn armchair by the window, its ribbed fabric rough against his skin. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Children laughed somewhere far off, their playful voices muffled by distance. But here in this room, there was only stillness, and the gnawing ache of reflection. He replayed every moment in his mind, the stop, the arrest, the brutality, the cold indifference of the officers who saw him as nothing more than a statistic. And then the crowd, the faces of strangers cheering for him, holding signs with his name on them. Their support had buoyed him, reminded him that he wasn't alone. But even amid the relief, a darker truth lingered. What about the others? Those without cameras rolling, without crowds rallying for them? How many stories ended silently, swallowed whole by a system designed to erase them? His jaw tightened as anger bubbled up, hot and unrelenting. This wasn't just about him anymore. It couldn't be. The injustice he'd faced wasn't unique. It was systemic, pervasive, insidious. And yet, here he was, alive, free, with a chance to do something about it. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind raced with possibilities. Protests, advocacy groups, legal action, education campaigns. There were so many ways to fight back, so many avenues to channel the rage and frustration burning within him. But where to start? A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. He frowned, rising slowly to answer it. On the other side stood Thompson, his lawyer, holding a folder under one arm and looking every bit as weary as Michael felt. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Thompson said, stepping inside when Michael gestured for him to enter. "I wanted to drop off some paperwork before you got too comfortable." Michael shook his head, offering a faint smile. "Not at all. Come on in." Thompson glanced around the modest apartment before settling into a chair opposite Michael. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his tone softer now, less formal. "Honestly." Michael sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know. Part of me feels grateful, I guess. Relieved. But another part," he trailed off, shaking his head. "It's like, why me? Why did this story get attention when so many others don't?" Thompson nodded knowingly. "That's a question we'll never fully answer. But here's what I do know, you have a platform now. People are listening. And whether you realize it or not, your voice matters." Michael looked at him sharply, his chest tightening. "What am I supposed to say? That everything's okay now? That justice has been served?" "No," Thompson replied firmly. "You tell your truth. You show people what happened to you, and you let them see how it fits into a much bigger picture. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut, but not in a bad way. They lit a fire in him, reigniting the spark of determination he'd felt earlier. He realized then that he couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything. "You're right," Michael said quietly, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotion swirling inside him. "This isn't over. Not for me, and definitely not for everyone else." Thompson smiled, a rare warmth breaking through his usually reserved demeanor. "Good. Because trust me, we're going to need people like you if we want to make real change." As the lawyer left, Michael returned to the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into twilight. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting soft pools of yellow light onto the pavement. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. But tonight, in this quiet moment, Michael vowed to himself that he wouldn't stay silent. Not anymore. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's life began to take on a new rhythm, one he never could have imagined before that fateful evening. His dark blazer, now cleaned and pressed, hung neatly in his closet, but the memory of its wrinkled weight still lingered in his mind. His scuffed leather shoes rested by the door, a quiet reminder of the long walk home that had changed everything. Yet despite the scars, both visible and invisible, he found himself stepping forward with renewed purpose. The media attention didn't fade overnight. Journalists called constantly, asking for interviews, seeking soundbites about justice, resilience, and hope. Activists reached out, inviting him to speak at rallies, protests, and community meetings. At first, Michael hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. He had always been an ordinary man trying to live an ordinary life. But as the invitations poured in, he realized something important. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt silenced, dismissed, or dehumanized by a system built to oppress them. One evening, standing before a crowd gathered outside City Hall, Michael felt the full weight of what he was about to do. Thousands of people filled the square, holding signs that read "Black Lives Matter," "No Justice," "No Peace," and "Stand with Michael." Their voices rose together, chanting slogans that echoed off the surrounding buildings like thunder. Golden hour sunlight bathed the scene in warm tones, casting long shadows across the pavement. For a moment, Michael simply stood there, taking it all in, the sea of faces, the energy, the collective determination to make change. When he finally stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. All eyes were on him, waiting. Michael took a deep breath, gripping the podium tightly as if grounding himself against the enormity of the moment. "I never asked for any of this," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I was just walking home. Just trying to get back to my apartment after another exhausting day at work. I didn't expect to be stopped, arrested, brutalized, all because of the color of my skin." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. He paused, looking out at the crowd. Faces nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears, others clenching their fists in solidarity. "But here's the thing," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. "What happened to me isn't unique. It happens every single day, to black men, women, children, all over this country. We're not alone in this fight. None of us are free until all of us are free." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause reverberating through the square like a tidal wave. Michael let the noise wash over him, feeling the power of unity coursing through his veins. This wasn't just about him, it was about the countless others who hadn't been so lucky. Those whose stories hadn't gone viral, whose names weren't shouted from stages or printed on banners. After the rally, Michael joined a coalition of activists working tirelessly to reform policing practices, advocate for policy changes, and amplify marginalized voices. He attended town hall meetings, spoke at schools, and collaborated with lawyers, including Thompson, to push for accountability within law enforcement. Every step forward was hard-won, met with resistance from those desperate to maintain the status quo. But Michael refused to back down. One afternoon, sitting in a small cafe with Thompson, Michael reflected on how far he'd come, and how much farther there was to go. Outside, the sun filtered through tree branches, creating playful patterns of light and shadow on the sidewalk. Children laughed nearby, their joy a stark contrast to the weight of the conversation inside. "You've done incredible work," Thompson said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "But are you ready for the long haul? Change doesn't happen overnight." Michael nodded, his expression resolute. "I know it won't be easy. And yeah, sometimes it feels overwhelming. But I can't stay silent, not when so many others don't have a voice. If my story can help even one person, then none of this was for nothing." Thompson smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "That's why they'll remember you, Michael. Not just for what happened to you, but for what you did afterward." As the days stretched into months, Michael became a symbol of resilience and courage. His face appeared on posters, his name echoed in chants, and his story inspired countless others to join the fight. Protests grew larger, louder, more determined. Lawmakers began discussing reforms, pressured by the sheer force of public demand. Yet even amid the victories, Michael remained grounded. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the weight of the world felt unbearable. But he also knew this: good could triumph over evil, if enough people stood together and refused to give up. Standing once again at the window of his modest apartment, Michael gazed out at the neighborhood below. Streetlights flickered on as twilight settled over the city, their soft glow illuminating sidewalks bustling with life. Somewhere in the distance, laughter rang out, a harmonious melody that reminded him of why he kept fighting. This wasn't the end. Not even close. But for the first time in a long time, Michael allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were moving closer to a better future. Together.
And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.